Architecture in California in the early 20th century. Saw that there was a great deal of diversity with lots of different styles and combinations of styles and different manners of designing. Some indigenous American or styles come from the American tradition, like the shingle style and various picturesque things, but then eclectic styles, including from the Beaux-Arts training of many of these architects, and often handled in highly individualistic ways. And we see Bernard Maybeck's Christian Science Church in Berkeley on the right here, and Julia Morgan's Hearst estate at San Simeon that she spent many years of her career working on. Then in the 1920s, we saw that the international style begins to make its appearance from Europe, as in Richard Neutra's Lovell House in Los Angeles. And before proceeding with our look at international style modernism and the various departures from it in succeeding years, I'd just like to interject here at the beginning today a subject which I neglected to include in the handout for this week, even though it's 2 or 3 images from it are in the study set of images. And it is important for me to at least say something about it briefly, which is what was happening with skyscrapers in the early 20th century. We'll see how this fits in as sort of background to some other things we're looking at. Remember that we saw how in the 1890s the skyscraper was created and refined by architects like Daniel Burnham. There was some who expressed the new steel frame system of construction that made the skyscraper possible. It was Burnham's Reliance Building again. But by the beginning of the 20th century, or the early years of the century, there was a kind of retreat, one might say, from this progressive approach. A retreat, at least in terms of the design of the skyscrapers. At the same time that the technological development was continuing. In fact, skyscrapers were getting taller and taller. In the early years of the 20th century, there were major leaps, one might say, in just the sheer height of skyscrapers. And here's probably the most dramatic example of this from the early 20th century. This is the Woolworth Building in New York, designed in 1913 by a successful New York architect named Cass Gilbert, who was a graduate, actually, of the École des Beaux-Arts, one of these architects who studied in Paris. This, I think, is one of the buildings that's illustrated in the study set of images, which is one of the reasons I wanted to show it today. And also, since I neglected to include it in the handout for this week, I'll try to remember to put it in the in next week's handout. It's when it was built in 1913, it was the tallest building in the world, I believe. It was much taller than those Chicago skyscrapers that we had looked at from the 1890s. I think this is now 55 stories tall, which is really extraordinary. But it was really, it wasn't drawing on this a tradition of straightforward expression of the underlying structure that we saw in the earlier skyscrapers. It's now has a kind of eclectic clothing on it, designed in this case in a Gothic style. All of the details of the building are Gothic, though one wouldn't really know it from an overall picture like this. It's hard to even see the Gothic details. The building is so large, and these little Gothic pointed arches and finials of various sorts aren't really evident unless one gets up close to it. And here's a photograph of the very top of the tower, where there's a little kind of an observation area up there. This really at the very top of the building is that observation area that you see on the left there, and you can see now that the details looks like a tower on a little Gothic church, but so high up, obviously, that you can't really see that very well from the ground. Now, actually, I'm taking a somewhat different position in this, or contradicting what Leland Roth says. If I remember his section on this when he discusses the Woolworth Building in his book, I think he says that that Cass Gilbert made the Gothic details here large enough that they could be perceived from below, from the street. And I just don't agree with him about that. I don't think. I think that the Gothic detail is spread over such a large surface, and it's so far from where one would see it below on the street that that it really almost becomes kind of meaningless to me. The original significance and meaning of the Gothic style is lost by its application to a building on this scale with this endless kind of repetition of Gothic forms. So I point this out partly just to acknowledge that different historians and architectural critics can have different interpretations of things, and if Leland Roth were here, we'd probably have a little argument about this. So there can be different interpretations on these points. And that's just to remind you again that you should not necessarily take everything I say, especially when it's in this kind of area of interpretation, subjective things, as gospel truth, and make up your own minds about matters like this. Still, despite the fact that I don't feel that this kind of Gothic style is really appropriate to a skyscraper like this, still it's a wonderful building in many ways. And for example, in its expression of verticality, the Gothic, after all, does make sense that Gothic itself is a style that emphasizes the vertical. And so in these early years of the 20th century, when the revival and eclectic styles were being tended to be applied to skyscrapers, the Gothic was often chosen because it seemed to be an appropriate form to express the verticality of the skyscrapers, and there is something to that. That's probably one of the points that Leland Roth would make if we were in a little argument about this. But the most telling evidence, I think, of this new direction of skyscraper design in America and this new attitude, especially the interest in the Gothic for skyscrapers, is revealed in a fascinating episode in American architectural history, which was in 1922. There was a competition for another skyscraper building back in Chicago. It was the Chicago Tribune Tower, as it was called, the headquarters buildings for the Chicago Tribune newspaper. It was a major competition, elicited entries from around the world. It was advertised in America and Europe, and there were lots of entries, and there was a lot of publicity and press about it. The story of the competition is fascinating, and the entries themselves are very interesting, and the outcome of it. One of the things that's interesting about this Chicago Tribune competition is that several of the European entries in particular were very advanced and forward looking, more than the American entries. And here's one of the European entries designed by Walter Gropius, the director of the Bauhaus School in Germany, and one of the people who was creating at this time what came to be called the international style. And when we look at Gropius's design, it seems clear that he was producing this almost as a kind of tribute or homage to the Chicago School of skyscraper design from the 1890s. It has this straightforward expression of the underlying steel frame structure. If you look at the proportions of the columns and beams, and they're not covered with any kind of decoration, so you can really see you see clearly the underlying skeleton sort of through the exterior facade. And even if you look at the window here, the type of window he uses, it's that Chicago window that we saw in several of the Chicago skyscrapers, with a fixed pane of glass in the center and the two operable windows on the side. So he's even picking up the details of those early skyscrapers. And it's a very rational and really quite an attractive design. And we might think that a progressive design like this should have won. But the problem was, or an irony, that Gropius, in doing this design, may not have realized or known that this sort of approach towards skyscraper design was now pretty much out of date in America. And the winner of the competition was the prize was, and the commission was given to an American firm named Howells and Hood. Wait a minute, I'm sorry. That's not what I want. That's wonderful too, and we'll get back to that. I thought I had that on the other side. Here's the winner, by Howells and Hood, and you can see that it's another one of these Gothic designs, sort of inspired probably partly by the Woolworth Building, and it's a nice design in certain ways itself, but certainly not as forward-looking as that design by Gropius and other ones from Europe. So it's revealing in terms of the taste of the time in America, and what, especially what a company like the Chicago Tribune, who wanted to have a design that would enhance their image, that they chose this Gothic approach by Howells and Hood. But the Tribune competition is interesting also, just in terms of the diversity of the entries that were entered in the competition. They're revealing and, in many cases, amusing as well. So let me just show some examples of some of the designs that did not win, but some of them took mention of one sort or another. And here we get to these sort of strange designs. These are two American entries, and so it's clearly expressing this new interest in eclecticism. Here, more kind of classical styles rather than Gothic. But it's also going back to what we saw at the very beginning of skyscraper design, when you remember that the first approach taken by people like William LeBaron-Jenney and others was to design a skyscraper as if it were conventional buildings sort of stacked on one on top of another. And this, and we see this clearly in these designs, even in a rather ridiculous sort of ways, where, for example, in this design on the right, which I can't remember who the architect was here, it may have been an amateur design. But here we actually see buildings that look like they're kind of stuck into the, not just piled on top of one another, but kind of slotted in. Here's a Greek temple here, a Greek or Roman temple, and then other temples in various forms just kind of piled on top of one another. So the other one has the, as you can see, the Parthenon at the very top up here. It's a little unclear how we're going to get up there to enter it properly. But so these are wonderful designs to look. And they were all published in a big book that the Chicago Tribune put together at the end of the competition. And we have a copy of the book here in the library. Maybe I should put it on reserve. It's really wonderful to look at all these designs. Let's look at a couple more. These are European designs. Not all of the European designs were progressive and forward-looking like Walter Gropius's. In fact, most of them also kind of came up with strange ideas for skyscrapers. And here's a German one and an Italian design, I think. So you can see they were all kind of, especially the Europeans, didn't quite know just what skyscrapers should look like, and they were fascinated with them. But I think my favorite of all was a German entry that did not win any prize. I think maybe this also was one of these amateur entries, but this was the idea this guy had for an American skyscraper. I guess he figured that this would appeal to Americans, and this is what in Chicago probably that Europeans thought that, I guess, that Indians were still attacking in the Midwest, and that, you know. So anyway, it's a fascinating episode, amusing, but also very revealing about, as I say, the taste of the times, and how different groups or schools of architects in Europe were different from what had different approaches from what was happening in America, and changes in taste. So it's a very revealing episode in American architecture. It revealed the ambivalent views of what the skyscraper should be, and what direction American architecture should be going in. Well, by the following decade, the 1930s, more progressive designs began to prevail in skyscrapers. And let me just show two skyscrapers from the 1930s to give, show something, sort of things that were happening more toward the middle of the 20th century. Here we see two New York skyscrapers from the early 1930s. On the left, the McGraw-Hill building that I think this must be a photograph taken just as it was completed, or maybe not even quite completed. It doesn't look like it's occupied. And on the right, the Chrysler Building in New York, designed by two different architects. The Chrysler Building was designed by a man named Van Allen. And by now, I think we could say that the international style from Europe is beginning to influence the design of buildings like this. But there are other things that we can see here also that are interesting to point out about these two New York skyscrapers. First of all is the shape of the building itself is different from most of the skyscrapers we've seen so far. With the parts that step back, as you can see, as the building rises, and a block that comes up and then it steps back a certain amount and then comes back up, and then the whole thing steps back. And it's somewhat similar. You can see that the pattern is somewhat similar as far as the proportions of when it steps back and then comes up here, and then there's a large rise and then it steps back, because they're about, well, the Chrysler Building is a little taller, I believe, but they're about the same height. So you can see a similar overall shape, and you might think, well, that's just coincidental, or maybe done for aesthetic reasons by the architects. But in fact, there's another reason for this, the shape of the buildings, this step back. And the reason is that there were new zoning laws in New York and other American cities that were being put into effect during these years in the 1930s, with zoning laws with setback provisions, as they were called, that regulated the shape of the skyscraper, and that after a certain number of floors, the building would have to be set back a certain distance from the block lines, the overall dimensions of the building at its base. And the reason was mainly that this was a response to the large number of tall skyscrapers that were now being built in centers of major American cities. And people began to realize, of course, that there were consequences of this when you had streets lined with these skyscrapers, that it blocks light from streets and ventilation, and that it's undesirable. And so this was an attempt to open up these spaces, at least to some extent, so that these buildings would not just create walls along streets of continuous building. These regulations of height and the required setbacks for these buildings produced what's called the zoning envelope, a term that is used ever since, which is the maximum volume for a building like this as a result of these zoning provisions. And ever since, this concept or phenomenon of the zoning envelope has been a major factor in the design of urban buildings, and especially tall buildings, of course, large tall buildings. And so that today, still, the overall shape of many buildings in cities is often virtually determined by this zoning envelope, based on regulations, which of course vary from place to place, but all major cities have them. And it's interesting, and I point this out partly just to point out that there are many factors which determine the shape of a building, especially in modern times, and some of them that one might not expect. There obviously are aesthetic factors and the concerns of the client, and economic factors, but also things that you might not ordinarily think of, such as zoning regulations, which often really determine to a large extent what a building is going to look like, at least what its overall shape is. Well, the Chrysler Building on the right here also illustrates something else, specifically that was happening in the 1930s that I should wanted to at least mention in connection with one building. We won't be able to see much more of it, but it's what came to be called, or was called at the time, the Art Deco style of architecture, and also in the decorative arts, Art Deco is found. There was popular starting in the 1920s and then especially in the 1930s in America. The Art Deco is a style that varies a lot. It's not all the same, and it's hard to generalize about it, but for the most part, or usually, it's based on geometric forms that are used in inventive and sometimes whimsical kinds of ways. And the Chrysler Building is a wonderful example of it, especially the top of the building, where it's the actual form is made up of these concentric circles, as you can see, with these triangular windows that kind of radiate out from these circles in a wonderful kind of whimsical way. And this unusual use of geometric forms is probably the most basic distinguishing characteristic of this Art Deco style, as it came to be called. And probably the origins of the Art Deco are a little complicated to get into, but I think basically it comes out of the art of the time, Cubist painting and other contemporary art forms, where geometric forms are used in unusual ways, and this came to be applied in this inventive way to the decorative arts, and then often to architecture as well. And the Chrysler Building's a great example. I just have a couple of other views of details where you can see this. Here, the patterning on the building also reflects the Art Deco. The building is made up of glazed bricks, and that can be glazed in different colors. And so the patterns, for example, on the wall here in the slide on the right, where you have this kind of chevron shapes, that's typical of Art Deco. And then you can see these circles up here with little metal forms that give that kind of glistening feeling that's also part of the Art Deco. There's sort of often a kind of shiny aesthetic in the Art Deco, and then these decorative elements here that are kind of like abstracted or cubistic forms of eagles maybe. And so all of this is typical of the Art Deco. One other view, this is of decorative details on the interior of the Chrysler Building, I think maybe in the elevators. And so it's a great example of the Art Deco, but one can find good Art Deco buildings and decorative arts throughout the United States in all the major cities. San Francisco, Los Angeles certainly has lots of good examples, and it's a wonderful thing to, it's fun to look for Art Deco buildings, and one can find them all over. Well, now I'd like to look at the main architect who introduced European modernism, or at least one version of it, to America. And I won't, this will be a kind of brief overview of some of his American work. This is an architect that I look at in much more detail in my course on 20th century architecture. Mies van der Rohe is the architect I want to look at, and in fact, like many of the things that we're seeing in the course now that we're in the 20th century, these are all aspects that I look at in greater detail in my the second half of my course on the development of modern architecture, 175B. So. So some of these things were just a kind of overview that we'll be looking at. Well, Mies van der Rohe, certainly one of the main creators of modern architecture, main figures of the 20th century. His full name was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. His whole last name is Mies van der Rohe. So if you're looking him up in an index or something, you look it up under M rather than V. He was one of the creators, the main figures of the international style in Germany, and his early work, which is very important, we won't look at it all here, of course, just what he did when he came to America. He In the late 1930s, he left Germany, one of the many architects who fled the Nazi regime. He came to the United States and became head of the architecture school at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, IIT, and in fact designed a new campus for the school. This was around 1940 that he started doing that, and here we see the overall plan of the campus and a model that he built superimposed over a photograph of the neighborhood in Chicago. And then on the right we see several of the actual buildings for this campus. And in some ways it was a kind of manifesto, one of the first things he did when he came to America, of his principles of architecture. In some ways, Mies represented the most extreme form of the international style principles, especially the desire for simplicity in architecture and also for uniform standards that could be applied to any building types. This is not, there's lots of international style architecture which does not do it the same way Mies did, so I want to don't want to give the impression that somehow this, when we look at Mies's work, this is all there is really to international style architecture. But he's just such an extreme example of it that he's a good person to focus on. And also he had such a great influence on American architecture. First of all, we notice if we look at the plan of the whole campus, that it's all based on a grid, and it's actually drawn on this kind of on this grid paper, or that all of the buildings adhere to. All the buildings are all basically rectangular, as you can see, and they all follow this grid, and so this gives an underlying kind of order to the design, but it also is related to the structural system, the actual dimension of this modular or a module that underlies the grid, and I can't remember what the actual dimension is in feet is, but it's related to the structural system, the steel frame that is used for all of these buildings, and the logical dimension that makes sense in terms of the structure. So the overall plan grows out of this modular system that underlies the whole thing. It's typical of his logical approach toward design. And then he developed a system based on a steel frame structure, which he almost always used. He preferred that. A lot of international, again, there's a lot of variety in the international style, and many international style architects built mostly in reinforced concrete and various other materials. But for Mies, he focused on one type of structure based on steel columns and beams. Again, this very single-minded kind of approach that he took. And then once this steel structure is built, and if we look at these photographs over on the left here, one can see maybe the steel columns and the beams. They can be filled in various ways, either with glass walls or partly glass with brick beneath them, or the wall can be completely filled in with brick, or other materials could be used. But it's all basically the same structure that can be used to serve virtually all functions. Mies's system of design is deceptively simple, and it's easy to just kind of dismiss it as being simple and even boring, perhaps. But actually, handled by Mies, it involves careful attention to proportions and to all the details of the construction, and everything is worked out in with great care and detail. And in fact, Mies is known for having said the phrase, "God is in the details." That was one of his favorite little, he had little aphorisms that he often used. Another one that's his most famous one, I guess, is "less is more," emphasizing this notion of focusing in, taking a problem and reducing it to its most basic elements. And in fact, the more one studies the buildings of Mies van der Rohe, the more interesting they become. And let me suggest this just briefly by looking at another building at IIT. This is perhaps the best known building he designed there, which happens to be the architecture building where he himself taught for a while. This is Crown Hall, which was built a little later. It was built around 1950. And it's certainly one of the, it is a good example of how the details of his buildings are worked out with great care and the proportions. Also, there's a classicism in Mies's work. Often, in fact, often his buildings are very symmetrical, as this one is, and one can really say that there's a kind of the spirit of classicism in Mies's work, despite the fact, of course, that there are no specifically classical elements like columns and capitals. And yet the overall spirit is somewhat classical. But if we look at this building, without, again, I go into more detail on these things in my modern architecture course, but let me just point out one thing, which is, first of all, I should mention that the whole space inside this building is really open to allow flexible planning for the different functions that take place in this building, which was another one of Mies's ideas, to encourage flexible use of space. The structure is this very simple steel frame structure of columns and beams, and the main beams that hold up the roof we see up here above the roof. And this is certainly not the normal way, or especially back in 1950, of building a structure like this. Normally one would have columns, and then if they needed to have large beams to support the roof, they would be built first, and then the roof would be built on top of them. And but Mies decides to put the beams up on top of the roof. And I'm just wondering, maybe I'll just throw out the question: do you have any idea why he might do this? There's no one really obvious answer, but it's interesting to speculate. Can you think of any reason why an architect might be? Structurally, it doesn't make much difference. It can hold up the roof pretty much just as well, whether the roof is sitting on top of it or is suspended from the bottom of these beams. So do you have any idea why he might do that? Yeah, there's a hand up down there.
Possibly just to show the form that it's really acceptable structure.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I think he likes the idea of showing those beams so that you really see what his system is. If they were inside, you could maybe see them when you go in, but it wouldn't be really as clear. He wants to he likes this idea of having this dramatic form where you see very clearly that this building is held up with columns and these big beams, and that they're large, and to be able to have these large spans inside. So I think that's it. Anything else? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, people didn't think about that so much back then, and also energy costs were not as much of a consideration for various economic reasons. But you're absolutely right that in more recent decades, that more and more has been a very valid criticism of buildings like this that are all glass. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's no defense to that, but it's a factor which has become of more concern and awareness to people in more recent times. And today, a building like this would probably not be designed like this. That's a good point. Well, partly that's right, to make it a more interesting shape. Though Mies really kind of liked shapes that were very simple. So. But it's true. It divides the building into these parts. So you have a kind of rhythm of the large dimension, the large bay, you might say, and then broken down into the smaller bay. So definitely that's a factor. Can you think of anything else in terms of the interior of the building? Yes. Well, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point.
Maybe there would be an interior simplicity as well as an exterior simplicity, because there would be structural support from the inside of the building, so you would see just the walls and the ceiling, no interruption.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the. I mean, I don't know that he ever wrote about this or explained it, so this is partly speculative. But just from sort of knowing how Mies's mind worked, I think he also wanted to keep the inside free of these beams because of this notion that that it was to be a flexible space inside that could be divided in any way appropriate to the functions. And if you had these large beams inside, they wouldn't really be in the way of headroom or anything, since it's a very tall space inside, but they would have psychologically suggested that the building was supposed to be divided into spaces bounded by these beams, and he wanted it to be a more universal space. So this is just to suggest, all of these things could be developed more, but just to suggest the kinds of the way Mies's mind worked often in the details of designing these buildings. Let's look at some of his other buildings. He really applied, his idea was that this steel frame system and basically the same approach toward this sort of modular design could be applied to all types of buildings, and including houses. And here's one of these, the Farnsworth House in Illinois, in Plano, Illinois, that he designed in the 1940s. And if the picture on the left doesn't show it too well, but it's partly just because it's such a pretty slide, I couldn't resist including that. On the right, if we look at the plan here, the actual house itself, this was designed and built by a woman named Dr. Edith Farnsworth. She was a single woman, and so it could be a very simple house. It didn't. It really basically just has one room. The house is here when we look at the plan, and it's all just one space divided up. There's a kind of service core in the center here that divides it into different functional areas, a kitchen and dining area and living room and the bedroom. But basically, it's about as simple as a house can get. And then there are terraces and decks which come down. And the photograph that we're seeing here to the left of the plan is looking up these steps, which you see here, just to relate it to the plan. The photograph is taken from about there. And so you can see that the steel frame structure of the house is just this part there. But then the structure continues to provide a roof for the upper part of the deck. Just about as simple as one can make a house. And yet, if we had the time to look at it in detail in the interior, one would see again that there are all sorts of subtle, interesting things that are done to create spaces that have certain psychological effects and properties, and it's an amazing house. His system applied to a completely different type of building, a skyscraper. And here we see the Seagram Building in New York that was begun in the 1950s by Mies, and it's the same system, steel columns and beams basically to create this very rectangular, modular building. There's one thing, however, that's interesting from a skyscraper point of view here. I had talked about those setback rules, and you may wonder, well, why doesn't this building have them? It's not, we don't see these setbacks here. And the answer is that Mies just didn't want them because he wanted to keep the building as simple as possible, and therefore, to satisfy these zoning codes and the zoning envelope, he decided to do something which he had to talk the Seagram company into building because it wasn't very cost effective, which was to sacrifice the outer parts of the building and to move the building back from the boundaries of the block and have it so that it could go straight up and just sacrifice the rest of the building that would have fit into the zoning envelope. And it shows sort of the importance to Mies of these principles of simplicity. Or just one other building in this very quick survey of Mies's American career, the Lakeshore Drive Apartments in Chicago, two high-rise apartment towers that were begun in 1948. This is exactly the same system, and in fact, they look the same. You wouldn't really be able to tell, perhaps from a distance, whether these are housing towers or office buildings. As in all of Mies's buildings, the details are worked out very beautifully. The designs are not as simple as they look at first, but still, it's a very valid question. There are lots of questions that one can ask about this style of Mies's, which had a great effect on American, especially American commercial architecture after the Second World War. Some of them questions which you're no doubt thinking of, or that you raised with the energy efficient question, but also just the more basic question of whether it's proper to treat all building types essentially the same, so that housing looks the same as an office building and so forth. And these are all questions that got people eventually to react against the international style, at least in its more rigorous forms like this. And we'll be exploring some of these questions next week. Well, in the 1930s and 40s, as the international style was reshaping American architecture in various ways, other things were happening. And one that received a lot of attention in the popular press, not just the architectural world, was the reemergence of Frank Lloyd Wright as a major architect. And so in the remaining the time today, I want to start to look at Wright's later career. And in fact, many of Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous buildings date from this late period of his career, from the 1930s to his death in the 1950s, such as, of course, the Falling Water, the Kaufmann House from the 1930s. Well, we saw Wright's great innovations of his early career, around 1900, the first decade of the 20th century, especially in domestic architecture, his creation of the Prairie House, which had a major impact both in America and Europe. But this was just really the beginning of the story of this tremendously long career of Frank Lloyd Wright's, which is so fascinating, and which again in this course I'm not going to be able to go into in much detail. In fact, besides my 20th century architecture course, I also teach occasionally a seminar on Frank Lloyd Wright, where we really can get into his work in great detail. In the teens in the 1920s, Wright's career went into a kind of decline for a number of reasons, interesting reasons, partly personal. But as a result, he did not build very much. He still did many designs, some of them very interesting, but he went into kind of a period of obscurity, and many observers considered him really a has-been, someone whose career was over. Also, he was just getting old at this time. But in the people didn't know how long he was going to live, and that he would actually have a much longer career. But in the mid-1930s, when he was in his late 60s, he suddenly burst onto the scene again with amazingly creative works, and began a kind of second career. His principles of architecture remained pretty much the same, those principles of organic architecture, but many of the forms were new and often extremely dramatic forms, as we see here in Falling Water. Built in western Pennsylvania on a creek, as you can see, or a small river, in 1936, designed and built in 1936, for as a vacation house for a family from Pittsburgh, the Kaufmann family that owned a department store. Most dramatic, of course, here in the Kaufmann House is the siting of the house directly over this creek and the waterfall. This siting made possible by extreme cantilevers, all made out of reinforced concrete, of course, and it actually was very complicated from a structural point of view to figure out how to support these cantilevers. You can see this whole reinforced concrete form here, the deck, and including part of the house, which rises above it, is all cantilevered. Then you see a bit of a kind of pier under here, but the reinforced concrete structure to support a cantilever like this obviously has to extend way back, and there are beams that go back way back into the into foundations in the rock. And so working out the structural problems was extremely complex. No cantilevers, at least this dramatic, had ever been produced before, and also unorthodox forms and ways of holding this all up. And the structural system was actually quite complex, and many experts told Wright that he really couldn't do this. This happened often in his career, that he had to convince people that his forms actually could be built. The plan of the house is complex too, with many levels and complex interior spaces. And in fact, it's almost like two houses that sort of intersect or collide with one another. One out of reinforced concrete, these great cantilevered decks and forms that all have a kind of a cubic, almost kind of an international style quality in themselves. And one of the interesting questions here is whether Wright himself was being influenced in some way by the international style from Europe. An interesting question. He never would have admitted that himself, but it raises it's an interesting possibility. But that, combined with, in a sense, another type of house made out of stone and growing out of the ground in a way that's more reminiscent of his prairie houses, maybe. And here we see these stone forms rising up that then interrelate in this amazing way with the reinforced concrete forms. It's almost kind of like a dialogue between two types of architecture. There are all sorts of wonderful things about this house. But still, the whole thing really follows his organic concepts. It's not an international style house, even though some of the parts look a bit like it. It's because his whole approach is still this organic idea that a design evolves out of its materials and functions, and especially responds to the specific site and the nature around it. It's very much in this kind of picturesque, romantic, we might say, American tradition that we've seen evolving throughout, and especially in the 19th century. Well, at the same time, in the mid-1930s, Wright was designing other exciting buildings, including one for a completely different function, a headquarters building for a company. This is the headquarters for the Johnson Wax Company in Racine, Wisconsin, the main part of which was built in the designed in the mid-1930s by Wright. But then the tower that you see in the slide on the left there was added in the late 1940s. The main space in the building is the one that you see on the in the right slide. This large open office space, reminiscent of Wright's Larkin Company building of 1904 that we saw before, but now structurally much more innovative, with these reinforced concrete columns that are in the shape of, that are very slender for one thing. They in fact come down almost to a point. They're narrower at the bottom than at the top, and then spread out at the top into this kind of lily pad shape, as they're sometimes called, lily pad columns or mushroom columns. Really an invention of Frank Lloyd Wright's. They'd never been, almost never been conceived by an architects before. And again, he had to convince the building inspectors and people who were had to approve the engineering of it, had to convince them that they would actually work. In fact, he eventually had to build one of these columns as a kind of mock-up on the site, and that then got loaded with sandbags to test its ability to support weight, and it passed with flying colors, and they were able to go ahead and build it. But so many of these ideas, it's interesting. The engineering aspect of Wright's work is interesting. He never was really trained as an engineer in a sophisticated way. He was not a fully trained engineer, and yet he had a kind of intuitive sense of engineering principles that often allowed him to do things which people more properly trained in engineering probably would have avoided or wouldn't have dared to do. One of the interesting aspects of his work. Also in the mid-1930s, Wright was working on adapting his ideas of domestic architecture and the prairie house, all of those principles that he developed in the first decade of the century, developed these for more modest clients, for a more modest type of house. And he came up with a name for this more mass-produced or modest version of the prairie house, which he called the Usonian house. And one of his first constructed Usonians is a house also in Wisconsin, just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, the Jacobs House, built also in 1936. This was his career suddenly just burst on the scene again with with all sorts of important built designs. In the Jacobs House, he develops this this idea of his of a modest house, which ideally could be built by average middle-class Americans without great resources and using designs that were published. And it's among the various aspects of the house worth mentioning is that it's on the right moves the houses right toward the street. Here we see the street. The house has been placed there so the garden part of the house can be the house can open up onto a larger garden, and the wall, the front wall facing the street, is almost a blank wall. There are windows up at the top, but the house is turning toward the garden to maximize the size of the lot. Also, if we sort of walk through the house, the street is out here. There's not even an enclosed garage. To save money, he creates this open area that he calls a carport, and he's really the inventor, or at least the popularizer, of the carport in American architecture. There are all sorts of aspects of these Usonian houses that really transformed American suburban domestic architecture. Then the living room and the dining area and the kitchen are all really one space flowing into one another. I think I have one other view of the Jacobs House here, on the garden side, and you can see how the house opens onto it really faces and is directed toward the garden. If this house looks like houses that one sees just normally in American suburbs, the fact is that it's because it had such a great influence on suburban domestic architecture. And in the Palo Alto area, one can see many examples of this, particularly in what are called Eichler houses that were built in the Bay Area in large numbers by a builder named Joseph Eichler in the 1950s and 60s that he acknowledged very openly were completely inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of the Usonian house. Well, I think I'm going to have to break off things now, but when we pick up on in the next lecture, I will talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's most unusual Usonian house that just happens to be here at Stanford, the Hanna House, and we'll show pictures of that.